All right, so in review of last week, can anybody tell me what do we mean by the term burden of proof, or what is the burden of proof rule? These are essentially the same question. What does it mean when you say the burden of proof?
It means that the person making a claim is obligated to support it.
Right. So, like you said, the burden of proof is the responsibility, the obligation that you have to defend your own view. So when you make the claim, you bear the burden, right? That's kind of an unwritten rule, but everybody seems to follow it, All right, how about this one? Does anybody remember what the second key question is of the Columbo tactic? The first one is, what do you mean by that? What's the second question?
How did you come to that conclusion?
Right. So I know it sounds condescending, but asking the question, how did you come to that conclusion, charitably assumes that they have thought about it. They've thought it out, they've reasoned it out, and they have arrived at the conclusion, and they're not just regurgitating information that they learned from somewhere else. So asking the question, how did you come to that conclusion, is actually a fairly humble and charitable question to ask. Just a couple more questions. Does anybody remember what the professor's ploy is?
Tries to reverse the burden of proof.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it'd be like, say I'm in front of this class, everybody's here to hear me speak, and I say something outrageous like, God doesn't exist, prove me wrong. That's not a very good thing for me to do. Exactly. So like what I've just done is I've made the claim, but then forced it on you to refute my claim. So I've reversed the burden of proof. One more question before we start. What would you do when the other person is overwhelming? They know a lot, and you feel like you've just like been backed into a corner. You don't know what to do. What's the best way to handle that kind of situation?
Right hook.
Just like kind of reveal your concealed carry.
You ask for them to teach you, like you're going to take notes. You know more about this than I do, so like explain this to me. So you get more information from the other person's view.
Right.
And then you say, let me think about that. So you don't have to give a response. And then you go research. Right. Yeah, and I think one thing that I wish Greg had emphasized in that tactic is when you shift from argument mode or persuasion mode to fact-finding mode, you're showing humility, right? You're admitting that they know more than you about that particular subject. And so like Nicole said, you're asking them to, in a way, beat me up, but do it thoroughly and slowly, right? And so I would say that showing humility is not a concession. You're not surrendering. You're being humble. You're being gentle and respectful, and that's a really mature and powerful thing to do in a conversation, because it can be disarming to the other side. When you show humility, it helps keep things civil. Yes, Scott.
One of the terms you use there is you're not surrendering.
Right.
That puts it, means that you're thinking of it in an adversarial type environment.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think the whole goal of this is not to set up an adversarial relationship, but rather to be it a conversation.
Right. Yeah, we're not in this to be hostile. We're doing gardening. You're not trying to get them to sign on the dotted line. You're just putting a rock in their shoe, right? So
let's go throw something there. Something that I've always remembered is in my first years of college, I was doing business, and one of the classes was talking about some leadership or something, and it said something along the lines of doing something that people don't expect, disarming,
Mm-hmm.
And so usually if someone is expecting you to do something, then you kind of approach it tangentially or somehow different, They're not necessarily going to have the same knee-jerk reaction because they may not expect how to react on it. And so that's always kind of stuck with me. And then the other thing is you guys already know this, but Jesus used to ask the people questions, after they'd ask him a question. And that's fascinating in the fact that, was he asking them a question that they couldn't answer so that he didn't have to answer their question? Because he had an answer for their question, But usually it was one of those things that was like someone would ask you a question, he asks a question right back, and it just totally changes the circumstances. Instead of sitting here being like, you're wrong about that.
Right.
I'll ask you a question. If you can answer that, I'll answer your question.
But it's kind of like the professor's ploy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Turn it back on him.
Yeah. So this week we're gonna look at the third aspect of the Columbo. The Columbo tactic is, as we've said, asking questions to lead the discussion and keep it civil and conversational. There's no pressure. This is easy stuff. You don't have to be the expert, right? So the first part of the Columbo is to ask the question, or some form of the question, what do you mean by that? Tell me more about what you believe. The second part is, how did you come to that conclusion? Tell me why you believe that. Because it's not enough to just make an assertion. You could, when you're sharing your faith, oftentimes people would just be, oh, I can explain that. Well, okay, if you can you can offer an alternative explanation, but you could say anything, and you don't have to offer reasons for that. So it's not enough to just assert an alternative explanation. You should push them a little bit to offer explanations and reasons for why they believe what they believe. And so this week we're going to look at the third part of the Columbo tactic.
Do we have to get a glass eye
Yeah.
to talk to people so we can actually duplicate him?
Yeah, right.
Gee, and then he had one eye.
Did he really?
Yeah, he has a fake eye, and so if you look at him, and he tried to act so that you didn't see one eye move and the other one just stayed perfectly still.
Huh. I didn't realize that. I have to look into that.
Just like Sammy Davis Jr. had one eye.
Huh.
But nobody here knows Sammy Davis.
All right. So this is about 38 minutes, and then afterward, hopefully we'll have time for some practice.
Hi, Greg Hochul here with Stand to Reason, and this is our third session together, learning the tactical approach. I hope that you had a good time in the last couple of weeks, maybe. Now, in our next session, we'll learn one good way to discover a certain type of weakness or a flaw. I call that tactic the suicide tactic, and we'll talk about it then.
All right. So we've got a little bit of time left that I want to use to practice. But before we get into that, are there any questions, or was there any part of that anybody found confusing, or any comments?
I didn't see his glass eye. Were you talking about Columbo or are you talking about Greg? I'm trying to look for him.
Oh,
The glass eye.
Were we talking about Columbo? Look at the actual actor?
oh, yeah.
You'll have to take
One thing that I thought was kind of interesting, or that I noticed is, the first two questions in particular can be used in a very brief encounter. The third aspect of that seems like more of an in-depth conversation kind of thing.
Which is why I think it comes last, because that assumes that you're kind of in it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot more flexibility in that,
Yeah,
because you've established a desire for a conversation with that person. And so I think there's a little more flexibility and a little more give and take in that. So it's not, I guess, in some ways the pressure is off a little bit, because you're not trying to get them into a conversation. They're already there.
Right,
So
right.
you can feel that out and get a feel for their views and the way they think and where they're going and all. So it's just an observation of them.
Yeah. I think the real wisdom in this third part of Columbo is getting them to put pieces on the table, because that is very unaggressive. It's not aggressive. It's very passive, because you're pulling pieces onto the table that you can use. And like he said, you're not attacking them. You're not aggressively shoving your views down their throat, because you're just using what they've given you. And that's really useful information.
Well, I think it's interesting too, if you put the piece on the table, they can refute that.
Right,
But
exactly.
if they put it on there, it's tough for them to take that back.
Exactly. Has anybody ever had the Columbo tactic used against them? Or can you think of a time when somebody led you down a primrose path, somebody was asking you a series of questions, and You feel like, oh yeah, I've had this before.
I've been on both sides of it.
Yeah. Okay, so there were a few examples in the video. So if these sound familiar, we have a little bit of experience from the video to draw from. So I think what we'll do is we'll role play a little bit. I'll play the devil's advocate, right? So I'm gonna throw a challenge at you, and let's see if you guys can come up with flaws. Let's see if you can identify the flaws in the challenge that I give you, and we'll practice with that. So here's the first one. You shouldn't push your morality on me. Stop pushing your morality on me. How would you respond to that? Let's practice a little bit.
Well, the first one is, what do you mean by that?
Well, I don't like it when somebody forces their beliefs down my throat. I feel like you're oppressing me. Don't push your morality on me.
What is it I said specifically that made you think that way about me?
Well, you're telling me how I should live my life. You're telling me what you want me to do. I don't like that. You shouldn't do that to me.
Let me ask you, do we agree or disagree that liking something is the same thing as should or shouldn't do something?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, I speak funny, so let me rephrase it. You said that you didn't like something,
Mm-hmm.
and that almost seemed like a replacement word for the previous sentence, which is that you shouldn't do something. And I think to myself, well, are we basing this off of should and shouldn't? Or are we basing this off of like or don't like?
Exactly. I think that's the big flaw in this challenge is the first two words. When you say you shouldn't push your morality on me, what are the first two words? You shouldn't. So what are they doing? They're pushing their morality on you. Exactly. So when they say you shouldn't push your morality on me, they're pushing their morality on you. They're doing the very same thing. So the flaw in this argument is that it's self-refuting, right?
Or the other aspect of that too is, how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah.
I mean, that's right there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, you shouldn't, okay? Why? How does this work?
Yeah. Let's try another one. How about this? This was actually mentioned in the video, so the answer should be pretty easy. You're just being intolerant and arrogant. How should we respond to that one?
I just always like to clarify, like, what are we talking about? I'd say, can you give me an instance of my intolerance or arrogance so I can better understand what we're even talking about?
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that? Like, What did I do that made you say that I'm being intolerant, right? Because usually this is how it goes. Someone would say, well, you're being intolerant and arrogant. And you would say, well, what do you mean by intolerant? How have I been intolerant? Well, you think you're right and everybody else is wrong. That's intolerant. You think you're right and everybody else is wrong.
I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, no, there's a lot of things in which I don't know, and there's a couple things in which I do know, and what I do know is there's a lot of things I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know what. It's Columbo number 4 confusion.
Yeah.
So, what is it, bathroom with something there?
Yeah.
You think I'm being arrogant because I'm arguing, thinking I'm right, which I could be wrong. There could be error in what I say, but do you think you're right in your
Of course I do.
argument?
Of course I do. So then what's the difference between when I'm right and when you're right? Right. So like when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant and arrogant. But when you're right, you're just right. What am I missing? Right? Obviously you're not missing anything.
Yeah, when you ask when you're asking questions, a lot of times, or almost every time now, words their meanings aren't tied to their actual definitions. So you would say, "Oh, you're just racist."
Mm.
I would say your comment right there is arrogant. Why are you arrogant towards me?
His definition for racism is believing that one race is superior to another, or one race is less. that's not the way anybody uses it nowadays. So it's like, well,
So
what do
on
you
that
mean?
note, let's try another one. How about this one? Well, that's just your interpretation.
Sure.
You are correct. Well, what's your interpretation?
Yeah, what is your interpretation? How do you see that? Teach me something. Let me know.
So this one's kind of tricky because when you ask what do you mean by that, there's a specific part in this question because this question makes an assumption, right? So when you say that's just your interpretation, you might respond with, well, what do you mean by just?
That is just my interpretation. It's not merely my interpretation. But yeah, I mean, what do you base most of your basis on? You know, where's the root of most of your empirical evidence or authority? Where does it stem from? Like, what are we presupposing any of this off of?
So playing devil's advocate, I would say, well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of equally valid interpretations, and yours is just one of them. But I mean, somebody else could have a different interpretation, and theirs is just as good, right?
Well, they could, as long as they were as close to optimally right. You know, the farther you veer away from the most optimal position, the more you look back and see how far away you are. So you can't see exactly how far away you are from the optimum point while you're standing right next to it. So what I would say is, I'd say, well, my interpretation is probably a little bit closer to the truth than yours is.
Yeah, I might say,
That will make him a little defensive. though.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it, guys. I mean, tell me, disprove me now. Like, I'm the one that made the claim. I don't have to. You made the claim. Okay, well, let me start this then. You know, but usually that sounded like an obstinate position to take anyway. It sounds to me like when people, they don't really have it worked out in their mind that these things really mean what they mean when they say it. How can you really say, well, two things are really the same thing, unless you really don't mean that?
Well, I think that, to me, that begs the question of how did you come to that conclusion? You know, I mean, that is just a perfect opportunity to me to see that is, okay, what are you say that mine is just an interpretation. Okay, mine is based on a set of facts that I have looked at and researched. What do you believe? How did you arrive at your interpretation?
Yeah.
And what makes all interpretations equal?
Right. If all interpretations are equally valid, then here's the flaw. If they admit, well, yeah, all interpretations are equally valid, then you're free to say whatever you want. You just be like, well, like Randy said, well, then that's racist. What makes it racist? That's my interpretation.
That's how I feel.
Yeah, this state
That's
was
my
green.
interpretation. My interpretation is just as valid as anybody else's. So therefore, I say you're being racist right now.
Well, you can also say that all interpretations are false.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, that's true. So if all interpretations are equally valid, then they're also equally false.
I saw
That's a very good point.
I
Yeah.
saw a YouTube video with I always forget these people's names. He's that psychologist guy.
Jordan Peterson.
There you go. So he's sitting here talking about he was talking about how if you go back historically and kind of try to figure out where we parse our ultimate truths from, the Bible stemming right there in the middle of it, you know, kind of concretes these efforts, because removed from that, you have all kinds of problems, and the test of time and scrutiny that the Bible's faced is that no matter what truth or trinket you throw up against it, you can still find things that seem like discrepancies, you know, but no matter what you throw at it, you end up with these other things that seem to build off of those tenets, almost as if these truths presuppose them somehow. And it almost seems like on a world scope altogether, and this is kind of what I was gleaning off of what he was saying, that everything kind of compels back to that whole Bible thing, and that anything that you think of really is almost tenet based off of these kind of things. Where do we get our truth from? Most of the stuff is based off of the stuff that's written right there in the Bible. You know, that's what we believe. But from a archaeological standpoint, if you want to go back and try to base, why do they believe this over there, and why do they believe this over there? And you're like, okay, well, let's research all the books and let's go through all the historical domains. You know, you still end up in the same place, which is you don't have an older set of tenets that reach back that's been concreted through time, and everything else seems to build their language off of even those things. You know, that's what it seemed to be presented as. So, It just seems to me like you can't escape it, even if you wanted to. You could make the argument against it, but where do we get our meanings for all of our words from? Where did our first words come from?
Are you arguing that everything in philosophy is reducible to language?
What I'm intending is that everybody has moved away from probably the more close usage of all the same anatomy on things, and so everybody's using all the same words, but they're meaning different things. So they don't really mean anything when they say what they say, because nothing has any kind of bedrock underneath it. But if you try to establish bedrock as any kind of continuity for any of your arguments, you always end up back at the Bible. Because even if you want to glean off of archaeological, testings and all kinds of stuff like that, you still come up with all kinds of questions where you go, well, where did you get that from? And ultimately, it all usually comes back to the Bible, because older sources don't answer anything except for Bible answers most of it. Mm-hmm. Not the black and white, that's not what I'm saying, but I know that was a whole bunch of this, not much, but...
Does the Bible use anywhere science to make a point? Anywhere?
Sure.
No, I mean verbally. I mean, are there people teaching the gospel in biblical times that use science to prove the Bible?
I guess I would ask, like, what you mean by science. Like, what would constitute science in your mind?
Your entire belief system. Do you need the scientific proof, physical evidence?
I mean, there's probably plenty of examples of parables that Jesus told that involved observation and, descriptions of physical reality. If that's all that is required for, constituting science, I guess I'm not sure what.
Well, there's some people out there that just, that's their faith system right there.
Yeah.
They can't think outside.
Well, really, what is that? Is it science, or is it just observation? The only thing that's true is what they can observe. They don't feel that anything's true that they can't observe, which is, that has its own flaws in it, right? So, like, there's so much that science presupposes that can't be observed, right? So, there's actually two kinds of evidence. I'll show you. So, in science, you have a priori, right? Well, not just in science, but in logic. You have a priori, and you have a posteriori. So somebody who says that nothing is true unless it's provable would be making an a posteriori judgment. A priori means that you don't have to have any kind of prior experience. That would be something like 2 + 2 = 4. Prove to me that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, you don't have to. It's self-evident, right? So a priori means it's self-evident. A posteriori means you don't know it's true unless you've seen it. You have evidence after the fact. That's what posteriori means, after the fact. Priori means before. So a priori would be like, 2 + 2 = 4. You don't even have to have evidence for that. It's self-evident, right? So the evidence, it's true before you even have evidence. That's a priori. A lot of people make a priori rejections of Scripture on the basis of their naturalistic worldview. They believe that miracles are impossible, right? And the Bible is filled with miracles. Therefore, the Bible must be false. That's an a priori rejection of the truth of Scripture, because they don't need to prove that it's false, because they just reject miracles.
Is that
the
the same
supernatural.
way with the theory of evolution, or the theory of this, or the theory of that, that's taught as truth and fact in our school systems?
Well,
the earth is so old, it's a theory of evolution, but you have to accept it. There was nothing before, and when two particles existed, they collided. You believe it? No. But it's a theory, and it is proof, and you will learn it. Who are those people then? If they need so much proof in everything, why do they take on the theory of evolution and teach it as fact.
Right, right. Well, and
That seems a
here's
violation.
another
Somebody's
thing. Here's
missing
another thing.
something.
Science can't prove that math constitutes truth. How do you scientifically prove the truth of math? Science presupposes the truth of math.
That's kind of like when they have like n equals 0 and y equals 0, but y times x equals 3, and then you're like, but n times y is still 0. And you're like, mathematical concepts not equal in the same thing. Or in the English language, why do we have ph when we have f? And all these, you know what I mean? ph doesn't equal f. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I think one thing, I'm just reading a book that Randy's given me, and it talks about I forgot, I can't get the word out. Probably not probability structures, but
Probabilistic.
basically it talks about what you have in your framework restricts what you are able to conceive of. And one of the things with, like he was saying, about naturalistic science and naturalistic worldviews, that disallows, like you say, the miracles. It
Right.
disallows certain things.
Right.
And that's how, we have to get to the bottom of what you believe and what the underlying beliefs are. And as a Christian, that's very important, because these fundamental beliefs, underlying beliefs, drastically affect how you perceive and how you are willing to accept things, and it clouds your next steps, basically.
Right, right. Which is why the third part of the Columbo is so difficult, is because, like I said in the beginning of class, it's easy to say, well, what do you mean by that? How did you come to your conclusion? You don't have to be an expert to answer or to ask those questions. But the third part assumes that you know the point that you're going to make. And I love the point that you just made.
Plausibility structure is
Plausibility structure. Okay. But I love the point that you just made, because the confinement of your worldview informs your perspective on the issue at hand. So on that note, that's a perfect segue into our last practice question. How can God exist when there's so much evil in the world? Can you find the flaw in this challenge?
I would say evil can't exist in this world without God.
Right, exactly. What is evil? If you're going to say, well, then there's no God because there's so much evil in the world. Well, there is no evil unless God exists. Because unless God exists, then what's to say that?
Compare it to.
Yeah, exactly. It's arbitrary.
Evil is just normal if there was no God or anything to compare it to.
Right. So in this case, we're making Scott's point that given that framework of your Christian worldview, that informs your perspective on these challenges. So when someone makes these challenges and you have that foundation laid, then you can see the big picture more clearly, and you can respond to objections
Did
like
God
this.
exist before evil?
Well, yeah.
So it came after God.
I don't know.
I like to.
If God is good and God's always been around, then I guess there wouldn't have to.
Well, if God is eternal, there could not be anything before God.
See,
Oh, right.
I get these weird feelings that Jesus didn't come to save the angels, and that the angels are different than the humans, and that they operate a lot like humans, but a lot differently than humans. And that you had Genesis, and God made day and night, and then he destroyed the world with Noah, and before then, the sons of man and the daughters and this and that. And a lot of it can be written off and said, oh, well, that's this or that. But you have this short section of the Bible where God made the world and destroyed it. And you're like, why did he destroy the world that quickly? Did it really get that bad, that he decided to destroy the whole world, kill all the children, and kill everybody because it got that bad, And then my thought is, Well, there's probably some history we don't know about back then.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you just made the claim that God destroyed the world so quickly, but who's to say how much time? I mean, it appears to happen quickly because it's all in Genesis.
Now,
Like
this
the first 11
well,
chapters, just boom, 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 boom. But
with the
it might not have been so quick.
genealogies, it's what, 1,000 years, 1,500 years, something like that.
But here's
True,
might be
that's a
where-
good point.
This might be how somebody messes with me. They sit here and they go, "Look at that crazy stuff in the Bible. You believe that?" And then I have to sit here and go, "Well, do I believe it or not?" Because some of the cases can be made. You know, like Michael's flying around at war, doing biddings. You know, during the time of Daniel. You know, there was war in the heavens at some point. You know, what does war in heaven even mean? You know what I mean? So it's one of those things where I sit back and I go, that seems a little bit more enveloping than it is understandable.
And that's, you're exemplifying one of the three things that Greg talked about in the video, which was anticipate, reflect. You have to think this stuff through for yourself, you know, to decide, well, where do I stand on this? Where do I stand on this issue? You know, whatever that is, reflecting on it is critical. And then practice is the third one, which was, you know, what we were trying to do here. So we're actually a bit over time. Did you have something you wanted to add?
I was just saying, on that question, I think the thing is evil. What is evil? And ask them, well, what is evil?
Right.
Explain it.
Right.
Oh, well, it's bad or it's moral. And then you go down that road. Oh, what is good, bad? Who decides what's good, bad? And that's self-defeating.
It kind of blew my mind when I first had that realization, because I listened to a debate with David Wood about the problem of evil, and the atheist was making the assertion that, you know, there's so much evil in the world that God couldn't exist because, you know, obviously God wouldn't want there to be so much evil in the world. And then David Wood got up and he was like, unless God exists, evil is just imaginary. There is no evil. There is no difference between, you know, doing something good and doing something wrong, because there's no objective point of reference. And when he made that case, it was just like, oh, debate over. It's like, it was a 2-hour debate, but it was over in like the first 10 minutes. It just kind of blew my mind. It's like, oh yeah, that just doesn't
someday
stand.
when it's all over and we're up in heaven, we're going, remember that class we had down there? You were wrong.
Yeah, and then the other one is they're presupposing what God would do.
Yeah, that's true.
How do you know what God?
That's true. That's a good point. So we've actually already gotten a little bit of a taste of what we're going to be doing next week, which is the suicide tactic, views that self-destruct. So what we were doing now is practicing, trying to identify flaws in these arguments, because you know, we have that foundation in our belief, you know, the problem of evil, you know, pluralism and all of that. Like Scott said, if you have that foundation, that will clarify and inform your perspective on these issues, and it'll help you to identify those flaws that you can exploit. And like Colin said, it's important to reflect on this stuff. Think about it. Like, decide for yourself, where do I stand on this, so that when someone does challenge me on it, I have a leg to stand on. I have thought about it. I've reflected on it. I've practiced and anticipated these questions.
For you, if Adam and Eve, right? They didn't know they were naked, and got the fig leaves and all that, and their punishment is that you will come to earth and appropriate. If that didn't happen, would heaven still be just God and Adam and Eve?
That's a good question, and it's one that I don't know that we could have a definite answer on.
I disagree with the premise there, with your understanding of the initial conditions. It doesn't say that they didn't procreate or anything like that. It says that after that occurs, that there would be pain in childbirth. It doesn't say that there wasn't childbirth before that. It just says that afterwards there would be pain in childbirth.
So there were more people in Adam and Eve in heaven before the fall?
That's what you're saying about
We
the
don't know
Bible. They say
exactly.
God kicked Adam and Eve out of the garden, but they may not have told you that God kicked Adam, Eve, and I know they cover like their first children, so this almost sounds sacrilegious, but I'm saying there's lots of times in the Bible where it seems to read a certain way, and then we assume we've received all the important trinkets of information, you know, when in reality, if you were to watch it in real time as it played out, it would seem almost like a whole nother story playing out in front of you. So yeah, I don't
There's a
know.
book. There's a book about that. It's called "Reading Scripture with Western Eyes."
Mm.
I haven't read it, but I'd love to read it.
Yeah.
It seems really interesting. But you're right. I mean, we have the tendency to read God's word through a specific lens, namely 21st century, Westerners. So like we come at it with a bias, and that's something we should work on.
So this is a silly thing, and like we still can't explain how the pyramids were made. Is that right?
There are theories, but there's no
I mean,
conclusive.
we got
proof.
iPhones and rockets, and we got AIs, and we got algorithms, and we got things, but we don't know how to make pyramids.
No, we know how to make pyramids. We just don't know how they did it because there isn't enough. There's insufficient evidence to show exactly how they did it. But we have pretty good theories.
So would it be theoretical to assume that like they may have had some help beside and the whole alien thing, right? So I'm not even having to dig deep, but I'm saying there's lots of times in the Bible where it doesn't say these people were visited by these creatures and these creatures gleaned upon them these things. You know what I mean? But I'm not completely sure that it didn't happen.
I got a question for you, just to get you to think. Okay, that time between Adam and Eve and the flood, okay, how far did technology advance during that time?
The strangest thing is
Now,
like,
one thing to keep in mind is the Tower of Babel occurred long after that.
Right. That was
Okay.
post-flood.
Right.
So they were one common language and were supposedly together in that sense, okay? How far did that technology advance during that time? We have no idea.
yeah,
Look at the ark that Noah built, right? I mean, that's just like a pyramid. How did they do that? How did they curve lumber that thick back in those days and have it hold in place?
and I'm not completely convinced there wasn't whole groups of 13-foot tall human beings running around.
Well, I think one of the things that Greg Kokel says is that you could say anything, but what are your reasons for believing that? Because it's possible, yes,
One of
but
my reasons
is
the
that the
Bible
best
doesn't dictate
explanation?
that I don't have to believe it. I
Mhm.
don't see anywhere in the Bible that tells me that I don't have to believe those strange things. And if I did, then I would sit back and say, well, that explains a lot. But the thing is that when I look at some of the things in the Bible, I go, do other Christians ever look at this sometimes and go, that's really weird?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is, do you have good reasons for believing it, or do you just want to believe it?
So for me, I almost think of it like this. I haven't been told a better story because there's too many headlocks in this story. Ones that seem to have hidden entrances and overbearing consequences. So the thing is like I haven't even met one where it's Lovecraftian in nature and has a dark outlook on things that seems to offer the kind of challenges that Christianity does. Because it seems to me like Christianity puts you in a humongous challenge to where you don't have any outs. You can't sneak out of this situation, Whereas every other situation, they explain it away in a way where it goes, well, it's bad and that's all you can do about it. Whereas Christianity goes, oh, there's deeper layers, and as soon as you start peeling them back, they hurt.
Maybe like the Flintstones, they had the dinosaurs in their quarry and loaded it up and they just lifted it up and they skidded it up.
But like there's some Christians nowadays that point at you and feel like you're saying funny things right there, man? But it's not. We got fish swallowing Jonahs, you know what I mean?
And the 13-foot people, I mean, there could be lots of different theories for that.
Yeah, but the pyramids are like 300 foot tall, so a 15-foot person's still.
Yeah,
gonna
I'm
build
6
it.
foot. This is probably an 8 foot, 9 foot ceiling, and we're talking about somebody that's this plus another half of a room tall, and a whole group of them.
So they can build
Yeah.
a 2-story pyramid.
Just
and
imagine
that's
like
not
they're wearing
figured out
shorts
how to
and
do
like
it.
running around on a wooden
Yeah, that's
floor with a
cool.
ball, and man,
Yeah, no.
I can't imagine such a thing.
There's theories on pyramids that they actually poured them in place. There's this one guy I was listening, he's like, look at this one block and like it's a mixture of, it's like an old type of cement almost.
Well, we're way over time, but I'd be happy to continue the conversation. If anybody would like to pray us out, anybody want to? Nobody?
Lord, I thank you for allowing us to gather here together today and just learn some tactics. And Lord, just please help us use these and to glorify your kingdom and get people to know you and help us be humble and love others like you loved us. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Randy. Appreciate it.
I thought we